This is pretty cool. A real-life Dexter's laboratory. Yeah, that's how you say it. A whiz kid with a very powerful idea. Max Logan shares his story in tonight's Someone to Know.
A 13-year-old just exposed what CERN has been hiding from the entire world. He had no script, no backing, no reason to lie. Just a boy in a room saying things that should be impossible to know. Scientists tried to ignore him. They couldn't, because what he described matches something millions of people have already experienced and nobody can explain.
The future that I imagine is the future, frankly, that we all imagine. If you got energy, you got power, you have everything.
He said reality was ripped open. He said we all got pulled through. And he said the machine that did it is still running right now. What happens next will genuinely disturb you. To understand why Max Logan caught the world's attention the way he did, it helps to understand what he was saying and how he was saying it. Most people, when they encounter a teenager speaking about science, expect a certain level of enthusiasm paired with a certain level of imprecision. The excited kid who half understands something fascinating and talks about it with more energy than accuracy. Max was different. He wasn't reciting facts he had memorized from a textbook. He was thinking out loud, drawing connections between ideas across physics, philosophy, and cosmology in real time, and doing it with a level of clarity that left people genuinely unsettled. Not because what he was saying was alarming, at least not at first, but because the depth of his understanding seemed so far out of place for someone his age. Max grew up in Nevada. By his early teens, he had developed a serious interest in electromagnetic energy, which is the energy carried by light and radio waves and a broad range of other radiation types that travel through space. He had also spent considerable time studying the work of Nikola Tesla, the Serbian-American inventor and electrical engineer who, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, made foundational contributions to the design of the modern electrical supply system. Tesla had long fascinated a particular corner of the scientific and amateur enthusiast community, largely because of his work on high-voltage electricity and his later more speculative ideas about wireless energy transmission. For Max, Tesla wasn't just a historical figure. He was a starting point, a lens through which to look at questions about energy that mainstream science had, in Max's view, either overlooked or left deliberately unanswered. It was on a local television news segment that Max first came to wider public attention. He appeared on camera and began speaking about electromagnetic energy harvesting and Tesla coil theory with the ease and fluency that most people his age might use to explain the rules of a video game. The news anchor interviewing him visibly struggled to keep up. Members of the production crew reportedly stopped what they were doing and stood listening. Within 48 hours of the clip being shared online, it had accumulated millions of views. Comment sections filled up with a mixture of astonishment, skepticism, and genuine curiosity. People wanted to know who this kid was and where he had come from. What made the clip travel so far and so fast wasn't just the novelty of a young person discussing advanced scientific concepts, it was the quality of the thinking on display. Max wasn't simply repeating information. He was synthesizing it, pulling threads from different disciplines and weaving them together in ways that left actual researchers pausing to consider his arguments rather than simply dismissing them. Several scientists who commented publicly on the clip noted that while they disagreed with some of his conclusions, the analytical framework he was using showed a level of original thought that was genuinely unusual. By the time he was 13, Max had moved beyond theory. He claimed to have built a working prototype of what he described as a free energy device, a piece of equipment designed to harvest ambient electromagnetic energy from the surrounding atmosphere and convert it into usable electrical power. The claim itself was not new. The idea of drawing energy from the environment without burning fuel or relying on conventional sources has been discussed, debated, and dismissed in various forms for well over a century. Mainstream physicists are deeply skeptical of such claims, largely because they appear to challenge fundamental principles about the conservation of energy. The idea that you can extract more energy from a system than you put into it runs against some of the most well-tested laws in all of science. Max, however, did not simply make the claim and move on. He demonstrated the device on camera and walked through its technical construction in a level of detail that went well beyond what most people, including many with formal engineering training, would have been able to follow without significant effort. News outlets picked up the story. Scientists weighed in on both sides. Some argued that what he had built could be explained through conventional means and didn't demonstrate what he claimed. Others said the demonstration deserved a more careful look before being written off entirely. The debate generated considerable coverage, and for a period, Max Logan became one of the more talked-about figures in online science and technology circles. It would have been a remarkable story even if it had ended there. A teenage prodigy from Nevada builds a device that sparks serious public debate about the limits of current scientific understanding and the nature of electromagnetic energy. That alone would have been enough to earn him a place in the kind of documentary series or long-form profile that occasionally surfaces on the more curious corners of the internet. But that is not where the story ends. Because at some point, Max Logan turned his attention away from energy devices and towards something considerably larger. Something that sits buried beneath the border of France and Switzerland, inside a circular tunnel roughly 17 miles in circumference, lined with superconducting magnets and home meant to the most powerful particle accelerator ever built by human hands. Max turned his attention to the Large Hadron Collider, operated by CERN, the European Organization for Nuclear Research. And the claims he began making about that machine, about what it was designed to do, about what he believed it had already done, and about what that might mean for the nature of the reality we all think we are living in, are what this story is really about. What he said next is the kind of thing that tends to divide people sharply into two camps: those who hear it and immediately reach for rational explanations, and those who hear it and find, uncomfortably, that the rational explanations don't quite seem to cover everything. To understand what Max Logan was claiming about the Large Hadron Collider, it helps to first understand what the machine actually is and what it was built to do. The LHC sits inside a circular tunnel buried between roughly 165 and 575 feet beneath the surface, running beneath the French and Swiss countryside near Geneva. It was constructed by CERN, an international scientific organization founded in 1954 and now supported by more than 20 member states. The collider itself took decades of planning and billions of dollars to build, and it represents one of the most ambitious engineering projects in human history. Its purpose, at its most fundamental level, is to accelerate subatomic particles to extraordinary speeds and then smash them together, allowing physicists to study what emerges from those collisions and gain a deeper understanding of the basic building blocks of matter and the forces that govern them. The scale of the energies involved is difficult to fully grasp. When two beams of protons traveling in opposite directions meet inside the collider, the energy released at that microscopic point of impact generates temperatures exceeding 1 trillion degrees Celsius. For context, the core of our Sun burns at roughly 27 million degrees. Seeing collisions inside the LHC reach temperatures nearly 100,000 times hotter than that. For the briefest possible instant, the conditions inside the tunnel mirror those that existed in the first fractions of a second after the Big Bang, the moment from which the entire observable universe is understood to have emerged. Scientists use these conditions to study phenomena that cannot be observed anywhere else, probing the deepest layers of matter itself and testing the theoretical frameworks that physicists have spent generations developing. The most celebrated discovery to come out of the LHC so far was the confirmation of the Higgs boson in 2012, a particle that had been predicted by theoretical physics for nearly 50 years but had never been directly observed. Its detection was widely described as one of the most significant moments in the history of modern science, filling in a crucial missing piece of what physicists call the Standard Model, the framework that describes the fundamental particles and forces making up the universe. The announcement made headlines around the world, and the scientists whose theoretical work had predicted the particle's existence were awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics the following year. But the Higgs boson, significant as it was, represented only one of the questions the LHC had been built to answer. One of the other major targets was dark matter, the invisible substance that is believed to make up roughly 27% of the entire universe. Dark matter does not emit light, does not absorb light, and does not interact with electromagnetic radiation in any way that current instruments can detect. It cannot be seen, touched, or measured directly. And yet scientists are confident it exists because without it, the behavior of galaxies and galaxy clusters makes no physical sense. Galaxies rotate in ways that cannot be explained by the visible matter they contain. clusters of galaxies maintain formations that should be physically impossible, if only visible matter were holding them together. Dark matter is, in the words of many researchers, the hidden scaffolding of the cosmos, the unseen structure that stops everything from flying apart. When the LHC began its first operational run in 2010, there was genuine optimism within the physics community that it would produce evidence for dark matter candidates, particularly a class of theoretical particles known as WIMPs, weakly interacting massive particles. There was also significant hope that the collisions would produce evidence for supersymmetry, a theoretical framework that predicts the existence of partner particles for every known particle in the Standard Model. Many physicists had spent entire careers building models around these predictions. The LHC, with its unprecedented collision energies, seemed like the machine that would finally confirm them. It didn't. The first run, which lasted from 2010 to 2013, produced no dark matter candidates, no supersymmetric particle, no evidence for the exotic frameworks that theorists had spent decades constructing. The second run, from 2015 to 2018, pushed energy levels even higher and set new records for collision intensity. It produced the same silence, mountains of data, record-breaking collisions, and still nothing. Theoretical models that had been treated as near certainties began to collapse. Physicists who had built their careers on supersymmetry found themselves in the uncomfortable position of having to rethink assumptions they had held for decades. The absence of expected results was, in its own way, as significant as any discovery, and it left the field in a state of genuine uncertainty about what comes next. This is the backdrop against which Max Logan's claims arrived, and his central argument was not a vague or casual one. He stated directly that during one of the LHC's high-energy collision experiments, something went beyond what the researchers had intended or anticipated, not in a minor or correctable way, but in a fundamental and irreversible one. He claimed that a collision inside the machine generated an anomaly in the fabric of space-time, so severe that it broke the boundary between our universe and a parallel one. He said it wasn't a theoretical possibility or a future risk. He said it had already happened. In his own words, we had an original timeline, and the moment the anomaly occurred, we were catapulted into an infinite number of parallel universes. The concept of parallel universes is not itself a fringe idea. It sits within serious theoretical physics, particularly in the interpretation of quantum mechanics, known as the many worlds interpretation, first proposed by American physicist Hugh Everett in 1957. The idea, broadly, is that every time a quantum event occurs, every time an electron spins one way or another, the universe branches, with each possible outcome playing out in a separate reality. Under this framework, there is not one universe but an effectively infinite number of them, each one a slightly different version of the others. Some differ only in the tiniest details. Others have diverged so dramatically that they would be barely recognizable. The many worlds interpretation remains controversial and is not universally accepted, but it is taken seriously by a significant number of physicists and has been the subject of serious academic work for decades. Max's argument drew on this framework but went a step further. He wasn't simply saying that parallel universes might exist in theory. He was saying that the LHC had actively caused a rupture between them, and that the evidence for that rupture was already visible in plain sight. He pointed to something that millions of people around the world had already experienced and documented, something with no agreed scientific explanation, as the clearest sign that a dimensional shift had taken place. That something is known as the Mandela effect. The name comes from a specific incident that took place in 2009 when a researcher named Fiona Broom attended a conference and mentioned to a group of colleagues that she distinctly remembered Nelson Mandela dying in a South African prison in the 1980s. She wasn't vague about it. She described the memory in sharp detail, including the news coverage, the footage of mourners in the streets, and a speech delivered by his widow. The problem was that none of it happened. Nelson Mandela was released from prison in 1990. He went on to become the first democratically elected president of South Africa and lived until 2013. What made Broom's experience notable was not the memory itself. False memories are well documented in psychology, and misremembering historical events is not unusual. What made it notable was what happened when she shared it. Rather than being corrected and moving on, she found that others in the room remembered the same thing, the same news footage, the same funeral coverage, the same speech. These were Not vague impressions or half-formed recollections. They were vivid, detailed, and independently held by people who had never compared notes or discussed it before. Broom later described the moment she realized she wasn't alone as physically disorienting, as though the ground beneath her had shifted. She went on to document the phenomenon and gave it the name by which it is now widely known. Once the concept had a name, accounts flooded in from around the world. People shared memories of brand names they were certain were spelled differently. Iconic movie lines they had quoted for years that turned out never to have been spoken in the films they came from. Historical details that large numbers of people collectively remembered in ways that didn't match the available record. The Mandela effect became a significant and widely discussed cultural phenomenon, sitting at the intersection of psychology, memory research, and, for a growing number of people, something stranger and harder to categorize. Max Logan looked at all of this and drew a straight line. He argued that these were not memory failures. They were, in his framing, scars left behind by a shift in the timeline, remnants of a reality that no longer exists, preserved only in the minds of people who lived through it before the rupture occurred. He claimed that the LHC, during one of its collision sequences, altered a single electron, and that this one alteration cascaded outward through the fabric of reality like a crack spreading through glass, pulling all of humanity from the original timeline into a parallel branch. In the original timeline, those memories were accurate. The brand names were spelled that way. The movie lines were spoken that way. The events that millions of people remember did happen, exactly as they remember them. But we are no longer in that timeline. According to Max, we are living in the copy, the branch, the echo of the original, and the only traces left behind are the memories, scattered across millions of minds that, taken together, point towards something that conventional explanations struggle to fully account for. In January 2022, scientists working at CERN announced a discovery that, in a quieter news cycle, might have generated considerably more public attention than it did. Researchers collaborating with MIT physicist Yenji Li and the CMS detector team at the Large Hadron Collider had identified a class of particles that had never been directly observed before. They named them X particles. The name was not a placeholder pending a more precise classification. It was a straightforward acknowledgement that the researchers who found them were not entirely sure what they had found. The particles were detected within what physicists call quark-gluon plasma, a state of matter so extreme and so unstable that it has not existed naturally in the universe since the first few millionths of a second after the Big Bang. In those earliest moments of existence, before matter had cooled and settled into the forms we recognize today, the universe consisted of a dense, extraordinarily hot soup of quarks and gluons, the elementary components that eventually combined to form the protons and neutrons that make up atomic nuclei. The LHC is capable of recreating this state briefly and on a microscopic scale by firing positively charged lead ions at each other at tremendous speeds and generating bursts of plasma that mimic the conditions of the early universe for the tiniest fraction of a second. Within that plasma, Li's team identified the X particles by sifting through the data generated by more than 13 billion head-on lead-ion collisions. 13 billion collisions to isolate a signal that, once found, raised more questions than it answered. The internal structure of these particles did not match any known particle architecture. The way their elementary components appeared to interact and arrange themselves did not correspond to any existing theoretical framework. One member of the research team was quoted as saying that finding them felt like discovering a word in a language that shouldn't exist. The researchers were clear that understanding how X particles form could potentially open a window into the kinds of matter that filled the universe in its very first moments, which would represent a significant advance in our understanding of how everything came to be. But they were equally clear that they were at the beginning of that process, not anywhere near the end of it. For people who had been following Max Logan's arguments about the LHC, the announcement landed with a particular weight. His central claim had always been that the machine was not simply studying the universe from a safe distance. It was reaching back, recreating the most volatile and unstable conditions in the history of existence, and doing so repeatedly, with increasing energy levels and increasing frequency. The discovery of particles that, Defied classification, particles pulled from a state of matter that hadn't existed for nearly 14 billion years seemed to many to be exactly the kind of finding that his warnings had been gesturing towards. To be clear about what the LHC is actually doing in physical terms, the machine is generating, for the briefest possible instant, conditions that replicate the birth of the universe. The temperatures involved exceeding 1 trillion degrees, the energy densities, the collision dynamics, all of it points toward a process that is not simply observational. The researchers at CERN are not passively looking at the universe through a telescope. They are actively recreating its most extreme early states inside a tunnel beneath the Swiss and French countryside, trusting that the physical boundaries between what is stable and what is not will hold under pressures that have not existed anywhere in the natural universe since the cosmos was less than a second old. Max Logan's argument, stripped of its more speculative elements, rests on a straightforward question. How confident can anyone be that recreating those conditions is entirely without risk? It is a question that was raised long before Max came along, and it was raised by people with considerably more formal scientific credentials. Francesco Calogero, a nuclear physicist at the University of Rome and co-recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize in 1995, published a paper in the year 2000 under a title that was deliberately designed to provoke serious thought. The paper asked whether a laboratory experiment could destroy planet Earth. Calogero was not a fringe figure making sensational claims for public attention. He was a respected scientist who had spent decades working in nuclear physics, and his concern was specific. He argued that collisions at the energy levels the LHC was being designed to achieve carried a meaningful risk of generating microscopic black holes, and that under certain conditions, such a black hole could theoretically grow rather than dissipate. CERN's own researchers and the broader physics community pushed back firmly against this concern. They argued that the energies involved, while extraordinary by human engineering standards, were actually modest compared to the energies involved in natural cosmic events, such as cosmic ray collisions, which happen constantly throughout the universe without producing catastrophic results. Safety assessments were conducted and published, concluding that the risks Calogero had identified were not credible. The LHC was cleared to proceed and was switched on in 2008. The point that some observers have continued to raise is not necessarily that those safety assessments were wrong, but that they were conducted and commissioned by the same institution that had the most direct interest in the machine going forward. CERN's researchers, whose careers and research programs depended on the collider becoming operational, were the primary authors and reviewers of the reports that declared it safe. That does not make the conclusions incorrect. Institutions carry out internal assessments of their own projects all the time, and those assessments are often rigorous and reliable. But it does mean that the process lacked the kind of fully independent external scrutiny that might have provided a more complete picture. What followed the machine's activation has been, depending on your perspective, either a story of extraordinary scientific achievement or a story of persistent and unexplained gaps. The Higgs boson was confirmed. That was a genuine and significant milestone. But the broader theoretical landscape that physicists had expected the LHC to illuminate has remained stubbornly dark. Supersymmetry has not been confirmed. Dark matter candidates have not materialized. The models that a generation of theoretical physicists built their careers on have failed to produce the results they predicted, and nobody has offered a fully satisfying explanation for why. Into that silence, Max Logan has continued to offer his own explanation. He has not retracted his claims. He has not softened his position or walked back his theory in the face of skepticism. His argument remains that the absence of expected results is not a mystery to be solved by refining the models or increasing the collision energies. It is a consequence of the fact that the experiment already changed the conditions of the universe being studied. You cannot find what you are looking for, he argues, if the act of looking has already altered the room you are standing in. That is not a metaphor in his framing. It is a literal description of what he believes happened inside the LHC during one of its earlier operational runs. The broader context in which all of this sits is worth taking seriously on its own terms. We live in a period where the relationship between scientific institutions and the public is more complicated than it has been at any point in our recent memory. There is a long and well-documented history of information being classified, suppressed, or delayed for reasons that have nothing to do with scientific accuracy and everything to do with institutional interest, political pressure, or the simple human reluctance to announce findings that create more problems than they solve. That history does not mean that every institution is hiding something significant. But it does mean that the default assumption of full transparency is not always warranted. If the LHC had produced results that its operators found deeply alarming, results that suggested the fabric of space-time had been disrupted in some measurable way, the question of whether that information would be immediately and fully disclosed to the public is not an entirely naive one. The social, political, and economic consequences of such an announcement would be difficult to calculate and potentially impossible to manage. The more pressing question for the institutions involved might well be not how to inform the public, but how to understand and address the situation before doing so. Whether that constitutes responsible caution or something more troubling depends on who is asking and what they already believe about the relationship between large institutions and the people they serve. What is not in dispute is that the Large Hadron Collider is continuing to operate and that its ambitions are growing rather than shrinking. A third operational run launched in July 2022, pushing the machine to higher energy levels than any of its previous runs. Future upgrades are planned that will increase both the collision intensity and the sensitivity of the detector systems, taking the machine into ranges of measurement that have never before been attempted. The scientific goals are legitimate and the potential discoveries genuinely significant. Understanding the nature of dark matter alone would represent one of the most important advances in the history of physics and would fundamentally reshape our understanding of how the universe is structured and how it will evolve. Max Logan is still there, still watching, and still arguing that the most important question is not what the machine might find next, but what it may have already done. Whether you find his theory compelling or implausible, whether you read the Mandela effect as evidence of a fractured timeline or simply as an interesting quirk of collective human memory, the questions he has been asking are not questions that go away simply by dismissing the person asking them. A Nobel Prize-winning physicist raised concerns about this machine before it was ever switched on. Millions of people around the world share memories that do not align with the documented historical record. Researchers at the world's most advanced particle physics facility have identified particles they cannot fully explain or classify. And the machine that produced all of this is being upgraded right now to go further than it ever has before. None of that proves anything. But it does suggest that the most honest answer to the question of what we know about what the Large Hadron Collider has done and what it is capable of doing might simply be that we know less than we would like to think.